What the daughter of a plantation lord was forced to hide. Dark historian. The grand estates of the South, with their sprawling fields and towering oak trees, were meant to represent power, legacy, and wealth. But within these walls, behind the polished smiles and carefully maintained facades, there lay a darkness so insidious it could break even the strongest of wills. Sarah, the daughter of a wealthy plantation lord, was born into this world. She was expected to carry the legacy of her family with grace, marry well, and uphold the values of an empire built on blood and silence. But Sarah's life, so seemingly perfect on the outside, was anything but. Beneath her beauty and charm, she harboured a secret so dangerous it could tear her family apart. And it would not remain hidden for long. In a world where the rights of others were bought and sold, Sarah was caught in the web of her father's cruel decisions, the sins of generations past, and a cruel system that allowed no room for escape. As whispers of her secret began to spread, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. Should she protect the family legacy at all costs, or defy the world that had made her its prisoner? Her decision would set off a chain of events that would not only destroy her family, but forever alter the course of history. This is the story of a woman forced to confront the inescapable darkness of her inheritance and the terrifying cost of silence. The story of Sarah, the daughter of a plantation lord, takes place in the turbulent and complex world of the American South, a region where wealth and power were intricately tied to the system of slavery. By the 1800s, the southern states had become the backbone of a thriving economy, built largely on the labor of enslaved people. Cotton, tobacco, and sugar plantations dominated the landscape, their rows of crops stretching endlessly into the horizon, symbolizing prosperity and the deeply entrenched social hierarchy that defined life in the South. At the heart of this world were the plantation owners, men and women of old money, who inherited not just wealth, but also a deep sense of entitlement and duty to maintain the status quo. For Sarah's father, Thomas Wakefield, this meant ensuring his family's legacy continued to flourish, with a tight grip on both land and power. But behind the polished exterior of the Wakefield estate, the family's prosperity was built on a brutal and oppressive system. Sarah was born into privilege, but she also carried with her the weight of history, a history that was not as noble as the land she was meant to inherit. In the early 1800s, the Southern economy was at its peak. Plantations were the beating heart of a society that revolved around the exploitation of enslaved people. At the same time, the abolitionist movement was gaining strength in the North, and the question of slavery was beginning to tear the nation apart. The political climate was shifting, and the moral questions surrounding slavery were becoming more urgent, more impossible to ignore. The Wakefields, like many Southern families, had prospered in this system, building their fortune on the backs of enslaved people. Sarah's father, Thomas, was a respected figure in his community, a man who took pride in his family's legacy and the success of his plantation. But as the winds of change began to stir, so too did the secrets that had been buried for generations. Beneath the family's wealth lay a history of betrayal, violence, and exploitation that would soon come to light. For Sarah, this world was all she knew. But the more she grew, the more she began to question it. What was the true cost of her family's fortune? What did it mean to inherit such a legacy, one built not just on land, but on the suffering of countless others? She would soon find that the answers to these questions would tear her world apart and force her to confront the unspeakable secrets that had been passed down through the generations. As tensions rose in the South, Sarah's story would become a microcosm of a much larger conflict, a battle between the old world and the new, between the forces of tradition and the winds of change. The choices she made, and the truths she was forced to confront, would resonate far beyond her family's estate, leaving a lasting mark on the history of the South and the nation itself. Sarah Wakefield had always been an enigma to those who knew her. To the outside world, she was the epitome of Southern grace and beauty, a young woman raised to carry the mantle of her family's distinguished name. With her striking features and poise, she was often compared to the grand dames of Southern society, the women whose influence and status defined the very fabric of plantation life. Yet beneath the surface of Sarah's composed exterior, a tempest brewed. The very world that had moulded her into an ideal Southern belle was also the source of her deepest conflict. Born to Thomas and Eleanor Wakefield, Sarah was raised on the family's vast plantation in the rolling hills of Virginia. From an early age, she was taught to walk in the footsteps of her ancestors, to uphold the family's honor, to marry well, and to never question the legacy of those who came before her. The Wakefields were a family of immense wealth, their estate sprawling over hundreds of acres. But what Sarah was never taught, what no one dared to speak of in polite conversation, were the darker roots of their wealth. The labor of enslaved people built the empire she was meant to inherit. The harsh realities of their lives, their suffering, and their bloodshed were hidden in the shadows, swept under the rug of Southern hospitality. Despite the opulence surrounding her, Sarah grew up in a world of contradictions. Her mother, Eleanor, was a devout Southern lady, the very picture of a woman of virtue and restraint. But Eleanor's eyes, when they briefly met Sarah's, spoke of a sorrow that Sarah couldn't understand. A sorrow rooted in years of silence, in the knowledge of her family's dark dealings, and the unbearable weight of maintaining the facade. Her father, Thomas, though outwardly loving and protective, embodied the system of power and entitlement that he had inherited. He was a man who valued tradition above all else, and believed that his family's prosperity was a divine right, a belief that would eventually clash with Sarah's own growing awareness of the injustice and cruelty inherent in the system around them. Sarah's education, though extensive and filled with the finest tutors, never touched upon the moral complexities of the world she inhabited. Instead, she was taught how to be an elegant hostess, how to manage a household, and how to marry into another influential family. Yet, as Sarah matured, she began to see cracks in the glittering world that had been so carefully constructed around her. The more she learned of the world beyond the estate, the more she realized that the wealth her family had amassed was the result of human suffering. The enslaved people who worked the fields, their lives defined by cruelty and deprivation, were nothing more than shadows in Sarah's upbringing. Their names forgotten, their stories erased. As Sarah approached adulthood, she began to feel the weight of her inheritance pressing down on her. The future that had been mapped out for her, a future of marriage to a man of equal or greater status, the eventual management of the estate, the perpetuation of her family's legacy, suddenly seemed suffocating. She longed for something more, something outside the confines of the life that had been dictated to her. But the realization that she could never escape the expectations placed upon her was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, it wasn't just the constraints of her family's expectations that troubled her. It was the knowledge that her father's actions, the very system that had made him wealthy, had cost so many lives, many of them close to her own. Her father's own actions had set into motion a tragedy no one could have foreseen, one that would test her in ways she had never imagined. This growing awareness, combined with her father's increasing pressure for her to marry well, would force Sarah to make a choice that could either seal her family's fate or tear it all apart. Her story, like so many of her time, was one of inheritance, but not just the inheritance of land, wealth, and status. It was the inheritance of guilt, of secrets buried deep beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when they would finally be unearthed. And for Sarah, that moment would come far sooner than she had anticipated. The first stirrings of rebellion within Sarah came in the form of questions, quiet and dangerous, whispered to herself late at night, alone in her room. It wasn't loud defiance, but a subtle form of rebellion, the kind that begins in the deepest recesses of the heart and mind. As a young girl, Sarah had accepted the world around her without question, living within the walls of her family's estate like a bird in a gilded cage. But as she grew older, she could no longer ignore the unsettling truths that lurked in the corners of her consciousness. It started with the discovery of a series of old family letters, tucked away in the attic of the plantation house. They were written by her great-grandmother, whose words painted a different picture of the family legacy. These letters were filled with references to the suffering of the enslaved people who worked the fields, stories of lives taken too soon, of families ripped apart, of dreams crushed beneath the weight of ownership. The more Sarah read, the more her heart ached. The family she had been taught to revere, the name she was proud to carry, was built on a foundation of bloodshed. Her own family had not only turned a blind eye to the suffering, but had profited from it for generations. Sarah knew that this was the beginning of something she could not ignore. She could no longer play the part of the dutiful daughter, the ideal Southern woman who smiled and nodded while her father's empire rested on the backs of the enslaved. She could no longer sit idly by as the cruelty of her father's world continued without question. But what could she do? She was just a young woman, confined by her gender and her status, unable to fight the powerful forces that had shaped her life. Yet, in the quiet moments when she was alone, Sarah began to formulate plans. They were not yet acts of outright defiance, but they were the seeds of something that would grow into a much larger rebellion. It began with small acts, subtle conversations with the enslaved people who worked the estate, speaking to them when no one was watching. She had heard the rumours, the whispers about the Underground Railroad, about the efforts to free those trapped in the chains of slavery. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a world where things were different, a world where she could help, a world where she could make a difference. But these thoughts were dangerous, even treacherous. They could not be shared with anyone. Her father, a man of absolute power within his domain, was not someone to be crossed. He ruled the estate with an iron fist, and any sign of disobedience, any hint of rebellion, was met with swift and brutal retribution. Sarah knew that if her thoughts ever reached the wrong ears, she would be branded a traitor, someone to be silenced and discarded. Her growing discomfort with the estate's system, however, could not be kept hidden forever. She began to notice the growing unrest among the enslaved people who worked the fields. They had seen the signs of rebellion, the glimmers of hope, and they began to speak to her in hushed tones. The slaves were not ignorant to the horrors of the world around them, and many had heard whispers of an uprising, a chance at freedom. Sarah, torn between her loyalty to her father and her desire to help, found herself walking a razor-thin line. There were moments when she would walk out into the fields, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the suffering she could not undo. She saw the worn faces of the men and women who worked under her father's watchful eye, and she realized, for the first time, how much they depended on her. They had always treated her with a respect that felt foreign, yet her position had always been one of dominance. But now, as she spoke with them in secret, she began to see the humanity in their eyes, the strength in their voices. Still, Sarah's rebellion was a quiet one. It was not yet the overt act of defiance that would mark the turning point of her life. She was still bound by the invisible chains of her family's legacy, still afraid of the consequences that might come from acting on her newfound convictions. And yet, the seed of change had been planted, a seed that would soon grow beyond her control. As the weeks passed, Sarah's internal conflict deepened. She could no longer look at the life she was expected to lead, the future mapped out for her, without seeing the weight of the past pressing down on her. She had become an unwilling participant in a system that she knew was wrong. Her rebellion was no longer just an idea, it was a force within her, stirring her to action. The question now was whether she had the strength to act on it, or whether the fear of losing everything she had ever known would silence her forever. As Sarah's internal rebellion began to take root, the reality of her situation grew more complex. She was no longer just the dutiful daughter of a wealthy plantation owner. She had become someone torn between two worlds. The pressure to maintain her family's legacy, to marry into another powerful family, to continue the cycle of wealth and control that had been passed down for generations, was suffocating. But alongside this expectation, Sarah began to see an opportunity to wield power in her own way. Her conversations with the enslaved people on the estate became bolder. Sarah began secretly aiding them, offering small but meaningful acts of rebellion, from providing food and medicine when they were ill, to secretly passing along information about the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. These small acts of defiance, while dangerous, gave Sarah a sense of purpose. She could not tear down the system all at once, but she could begin to chip away at its foundation, one secret act at a time. Yet, Sarah's growing manipulation of the world around her did not stop at the estate's boundaries. Her relationships with the people she once considered equals began to shift. She no longer felt comfortable in the lavish social gatherings that were a regular part of Southern aristocratic life. The balls, the grand dinners, the discussions about the latest fashions and trade deals, all of it felt increasingly hollow to her. Her role as the belle of the ball, the charming daughter of Thomas Wakefield, was a mask that grew heavier with each passing day. In her interactions with her father, she began to play a dangerous game. She could no longer remain the obedient daughter who deferred to his every decision. Sarah's growing awareness of the world's injustices was pushing her to take calculated risks. Risks that involved manipulating her father and his associates, pulling strings in ways she never thought possible. She began to subtly turn his own ideas back on him, suggesting business ventures that would bring more profit, but also set her father on a path that could lead to the exposure of certain practices that were better left hidden. Sarah's actions began to sow discord among the family and among the people who worked for them. Her father, once a man whose word was law on the estate, began to notice the subtle shift in Sarah's behavior. His daughter no longer saw him as the patriarch who ruled over her life, but as a man whose power she had begun to question. She no longer hesitated to question his decisions, to challenge him on matters of business and family. Thomas, however, was no fool. He sensed that his daughter was becoming more independent, more defiant. He was both angry and fearful, unable to reconcile the daughter he had raised with the woman she was becoming. But his response was not one of open confrontation. Instead, he began to manipulate Sarah in ways she hadn't anticipated. He began to feed her doubts, playing on her insecurities and fears, reminding her of the price of rebellion. He spoke of the family's reputation, of the importance of keeping the estate intact, of the lives that depended on their wealth and status. Yet, as Thomas spoke, Sarah began to realize something that would forever change her perspective. Her father wasn't just using fear to control her. He was also using guilt. He made her feel as though her actions, however small, could destroy everything they had built. And in many ways, he was right. But Sarah had reached a point where she was no longer afraid of the consequences. The more her father pushed her, the more she realized that she could never go back to the life she had once known. The manipulation between father and daughter became a dangerous dance, a game of power, guilt, and control. Sarah played her part, weaving in and out of her father's influence, but all the while, she was growing bolder in her defiance. She became more strategic, more calculated in her interactions with the people who worked for her family, using her position to gather information, to plan, to prepare for the day when she would no longer be silent. But as the tension between Sarah and her father escalated, so too did the danger. The more Sarah pushed against the boundaries of her world, the more she risked losing everything. Her secret actions, though subtle, began to catch the attention of others. Whispers of her defiance began to spread, and the lines between rebellion and ruin grew dangerously thin. Sarah's growing manipulation wasn't just about undermining her father. It was about something far deeper. It was about rewriting her own story, about taking control of her destiny in a world that had long tried to define her. But as the stakes grew higher, Sarah realized that the power she sought to wield would come at a devastating price. The more she played the game of manipulation and power, the more she would lose herself in the process. The question now was not whether Sarah would rebel, but whether she could maintain her humanity as she fought for a future of her own making. Sarah's journey of rebellion had been a slow burn, a quiet defiance that began with whispered secrets and subtle manipulations. But as the months passed, the pressure inside her, the pressure to act, to stand up, to make a choice that would forever change the course of her life, grew unbearable. Her growing awareness of the injustice that surrounded her, coupled with her own struggle to break free from the chains of her family's legacy, reached a tipping point. It was no longer enough to act in the shadows, to play her part behind closed doors. Sarah had come to realize that true freedom would only come if she made a public stand, a stand that would not only defy her father, but would defy the very system that had been built on the suffering of others. The moment of reckoning came in the form of a lavish gala hosted by her father, a grand affair that brought together the most powerful families in the region. It was meant to be a celebration of the Wakefield estate's continued success, a night of opulence and decadence where the elite could mingle and boast about their wealth and power. But for Sarah, the night became something entirely different. It became the stage for her final act of rebellion. As the night unfolded, Sarah found herself surrounded by the usual crowd of plantation owners, politicians, and businessmen, all of them basking in their own self-importance, all of them oblivious to the torment that their wealth had been built upon. Her father, ever the master of ceremonies, stood at the center of it all, commanding the room with his booming voice, his hand constantly on the pulse of the gathering. But as Sarah watched him, she could no longer see the man who had raised her. She saw only a tyrant, a man who had shaped her life and the lives of so many others into something she could no longer accept. In that moment, Sarah made a choice. She had known for some time that the decision would come, that the time for quiet rebellion had passed. But she had never imagined that it would happen this way, in front of so many people. As the night wore on, Sarah began to make her move. She slipped away from the main hall, unnoticed by the guests, and went to the garden where the enslaved people who worked the estate often gathered in secret to speak with each other. It was a place of refuge, a place where they could momentarily escape the horrors of their lives. It was here that Sarah found the courage to act. She summoned one of the overseers, a man she had known for years, and instructed him to release several of the enslaved people from their duties for the night. But instead of allowing them to retreat into the shadows as they normally would, she ordered that they be brought to the front of the gala, to stand in full view of the guests. As they walked into the ballroom, Sarah's voice rang out, commanding attention from the crowd. She stood at the top of the staircase, her gaze fixed firmly on her father as he turned to see the procession. The room fell silent. "I have lived in this house," Sarah said, her voice unwavering, "and I have lived with this legacy. I have seen the cruelty, the injustice, and the pain that has been buried beneath these walls for far too long, and I cannot be a part of it any longer." Her words echoed through the room, a challenge to everything that had come before. The guests, initially stunned by her words, began to murmur among themselves, unsure of what to do. But Sarah was not finished. "You all speak of wealth, of power, of honor," she continued, her eyes now sweeping over the faces of the men and women who had profited from the exploitation of others. "But what is the price of all of this? What is the cost of this land, this legacy, this power?" She turned to the enslaved people who stood beside her, their faces marked with the scars of years of hardship and suffering. "These are not just workers. These are not just slaves. These are human beings." Sarah's voice broke, but she steadied herself, pushing forward. "And I will no longer stand by and watch as their lives are destroyed for the sake of a fortune built on blood." The silence in the room was deafening. Thomas Wakefield, now pale and furious, stepped forward, his hand shaking with anger. "Sarah, you cannot do this. You will ruin us. This is our legacy. You cannot throw it all away." But Sarah was resolute. "I would rather lose everything," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination, "than continue to live in a world built on this." With that, she turned her back on her father and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned crowd and a legacy she could no longer bear to be a part of. The moment had arrived. Sarah's public act of defiance was a declaration of war against everything she had been taught to uphold. And as she stood outside the mansion, gazing out at the vast estate, she realized that there was no turning back. Her decision would set in motion a chain of events that could never be undone. The rebellion she had ignited would not be confined to the walls of her family's estate. It would spread beyond her father's control, and it would forever alter the course of Sarah's life. In that moment, Sarah knew the cost of her rebellion. She would lose everything: her family, her home, her place in society. But she had already lost her soul to the system that had shackled her, and nothing could ever make her go back. The morning after Sarah's defiant declaration, the estate was in chaos. The lavish ballroom, once filled with the laughter and clinking glasses of the elite, had become a battlefield of whispers and accusations. Her father, Thomas Wakefield, paced the grand hallway of their home, his face drawn and his eyes burning with fury. His daughter had betrayed him, shattered the family's carefully curated reputation, and exposed the brutal truths that lay beneath their opulence. He couldn't fathom how it had come to this, how the daughter he had raised, the young woman he had moulded in his image, could turn on him so completely. Sarah had made her choice, and now the consequences of that choice were unfolding before her. The very foundations of the Wakefield estate, built on decades of blood and wealth, were crumbling. It wasn't just the loss of status that cut deep, it was the shattering of a carefully constructed illusion, the illusion of power, of control, of invincibility. For years Thomas had ruled his domain with an iron grip, convinced that nothing could ever touch him, that Sarah's rebellion had changed everything. The repercussions came swiftly. Word of Sarah's public defiance spread like wildfire, reaching the farthest corners of the South. It didn't take long for the wealthiest plantation owners to rally against her, to see her not as a tragic figure of rebellion, but as a dangerous threat to the system they had worked so hard to preserve. Her father's allies, the men who had supported the Wakefield family for generations, began to turn their backs on him. The people who had once revered Thomas Wakefield now whispered behind his back, questioning his authority, his ability to control his own blood. Sarah's defiance had ignited something that no one, not even her father, could have anticipated. The enslaved people who had quietly lived under her family's rule began to rise. The whispers of revolt that had circulated in secret for years grew louder. The rebellion she had sparked spread throughout the estate, and soon it was no longer just a matter of a daughter's disobedience. It was a full-fledged movement, one that threatened to topple everything. Her father's response was swift and brutal. He called upon his most trusted men, overseers, guards, anyone who could be relied upon to restore order. They were sent to quell the unrest, to punish those who dared to follow Sarah's example. But the more he tried to suppress the rebellion, the more it spread. The enslaved people, once so fearful of retribution, had seen Sarah's courage, and it fueled their own. They began to rise up, demanding their freedom, demanding justice, demanding an end to the life they had been forced to endure. Sarah, for her part, knew that there was no going back. She had already severed the ties that bound her to her family, to her father's empire. But as the violence escalated, as the fires of rebellion spread across the estate, Sarah began to question the very cost of her actions. She had never imagined that her rebellion would lead to this, that her desire to free herself from her father's control would set in motion a chain of events so powerful, so uncontrollable, that it would threaten to engulf everyone around her. The final blow came when her father, desperate and broken, confronted her in the quiet of the garden, the same garden where she had made her stand just days before. He was no longer the proud plantation owner who had once commanded respect with a single word. He was a man on the verge of losing everything. His voice cracked as he spoke. "You've destroyed us, Sarah," Thomas said, his words laced with both anger and sorrow. "Do you understand what you've done? You've made a mockery of everything we've built. You've thrown away our future, your future." Sarah stood before him, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. "I don't want this future, Father," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "I can't be a part of a legacy built on lies and cruelty. I won't be." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Then, with a slow shake of his head, Thomas turned and walked away. The love he had once felt for his daughter had been replaced with an overwhelming sense of betrayal. He knew, deep down, that Sarah's rebellion was not just an attack on him, it was an attack on everything he had ever believed in. The days that followed were a blur of violence and turmoil. Sarah was forced to flee the estate, leaving behind the only home she had ever known. Her family, her legacy, were no longer hers to claim. The Wakefield name, once a symbol of power, now stood as a monument to betrayal and loss. Her father's fortune, built on the suffering of others, began to unravel as the rebellion spread beyond the estate's walls. The slaves had risen, and with them, the ideals Sarah had fought so hard to embody, freedom, justice, equality, began to take root. But the cost of her rebellion was heavy. Sarah had lost everything, her family, her home, the life she had been promised. And yet, as she looked back one final time at the burning estate, she realized that she had gained something far more valuable than any inheritance could provide: her freedom. It had come at a great price, but it was hers, and it could never be taken from her again. The story of Sarah Wakefield, once the beloved daughter of a wealthy plantation lord, became a tragic legend, one that was passed down through the generations, whispered in the corners of history where its echoes could not be silenced. Her name, once synonymous with grace and beauty, was now tied to the painful truths of her rebellion, a rebellion that had shattered the world she had known. The legacy she left behind was one of resistance, a defiance against the cruelty of a system that had for so long been hidden beneath the veil of tradition and wealth. In the years that followed her departure from the estate, Sarah's actions continued to resonate across the South. The rebellion she had sparked did not die with her flight. Instead, it grew. The enslaved people who had once toiled under her family's rule now had a voice, a purpose, and the strength to stand up for what they had long been denied. Sarah had given them that voice. Her decision to stand in front of the world and declare her truth had inspired a movement that would echo far beyond the confines of her family's estate. But Sarah's personal story, her own internal struggle, was one of bittersweet reflection. She had achieved something remarkable. She had freed herself from the suffocating chains of her father's legacy, and in doing so, she had changed the course of her own destiny. Yet the cost of that freedom was immense. She would never return to the life she had once known. Her family, fractured by her rebellion, would never be the same. Her father, now a broken man, would live out his remaining years in isolation, haunted by the very daughter who had once been his greatest pride. As for Sarah, she spent the rest of her days in quiet exile, far from the eyes of the world. She lived in a modest cabin, surrounded by the remnants of the movement she had ignited, always haunted by the ghosts of her past. She could never fully escape the legacy of her family, nor the consequences of her choices. But in the solitude of her final years, Sarah found something she had longed for: peace. It was a peace born not from the comfort of wealth, but from the knowledge that she had done what was right. She had broken the chains that bound her, and in doing so, she had set the stage for a future built on justice, not on the suffering of others. Her legacy, though marked by loss and sacrifice, would forever be remembered by those whose lives she had touched. In the history of the South, Sarah's name would be written not in the annals of aristocracy, but among the names of those who fought for the freedom of the oppressed, the forgotten, and the silenced. Her defiance, though fleeting in time, had left a mark on the world that could never be erased. Her story serves as a reminder of the power of one person's voice to challenge the foundations of an entire system. It speaks to the unrelenting human desire for justice, for truth, and for the freedom to choose one's own path, no matter the cost. Sarah's life was a tragic tale of rebellion, but it was also one of redemption, not just for her, but for the generations that followed. Though her name may not be remembered in the halls of power, it lives on in the hearts of those who continue to fight for a world where freedom, equality, and justice are not just ideals, but realities. Sarah Wakefield's legacy is not one of wealth or title, but of the unshakable belief that every person, no matter their station, deserves to live in a world free from oppression and cruelty. And in the quiet reflection of her life, we are left with a question that reverberates through history. What is the cost of silence? And what is the price of speaking out? Sarah Wakefield's story, though deeply rooted in the history of a particular time and place, offers timeless lessons on the consequences of inherited guilt and the courage required to confront it. Her rebellion wasn't just against her father or the plantation system. It was a defiance against a centuries-old legacy of injustice. The choices she made in that garden, under the weight of family, power, and tradition, became a beacon for those who would rise up against the systems that sought to dehumanize them. Her actions, though resulting in loss and sacrifice, ultimately paved the way for change. A change not only in the South, but in the hearts of all who heard her story. Her legacy, born of rebellion, lived on as a testament to the truth that sometimes, in order to break free from a cycle of oppression, one must be willing to lose everything. For Sarah, the ultimate cost of freedom was steep, but the price of silence would have been far greater. As we close the chapter on this dark history, we are reminded that the fight for justice, though long and difficult, is always worth it. The chains that bind us are not always visible, but the courage to break them can echo through generations, igniting revolutions, both personal and collective, that have the power to transform the world.